We have been told $1 million sounds secure, but that idea ages faster than people expect. It feels like a complete answer, yet retirement rarely behaves like a clean spreadsheet. The number looks large when you say it once, quietly and without context, but the next 20 years will keep asking that money harder questions. Not just how much you saved, but how patiently it can endure. Because retirement is not a single purchase you make and finish. It is a long season of small decisions that keep compounding. Groceries rise a little, insurance rises a little, and repairs arrive uninvited. Then suddenly the million is not a fortress, just a resource. And resources need management, boundaries, and emotional discipline to remain protective. This is where many retirees become anxious without telling anyone. They are not reckless people, and they are not bad planners. They simply discover that safety feels different once paychecks stop. Before retirement, uncertainty can be covered by next month's income. After retirement, uncertainty starts touching the money meant for everything else. That shift is financial, but it is also deeply psychological. $1 million can disappear slowly while still feeling emotionally sudden. That is why protecting it matters more than celebrating it. The goal is not to admire the balance once. The goal is to keep translating that balance into dependable life. And dependable life usually costs more than people first assume. Not because they are extravagant, but because life keeps moving. Your body changes, your home ages, and your priorities become more personal. You may spend less on commuting, but more on comfort. You may spend less on work clothes, but more on care. And almost nobody regrets underestimating how much peace of mind costs. So the real question is not whether 1 million is impressive. The real question is what kind of retirement that million must serve. For some people, it supports a modest and stable routine. For others, it must carry travel, family help, and larger housing costs. Same number, completely different pressure, completely different future. That is why broad advice often feels comforting, but incomplete. It gives people a benchmark without revealing the emotional fine print. And the fine print is where retirement either softens or tightens. A portfolio can look healthy while a retiree still feels cornered. That happens when spending lacks a plan and fear drives every choice. It also happens when optimism becomes another form of avoidance. Neither panic nor denial protects money for 20 long years. What protects it is clarity, flexibility, and a realistic spending rhythm. That rhythm has to survive good markets and disappointing ones. It has to survive inflation without making you afraid to live. It has to survive surprises without turning every purchase into guilt. And it has to leave room for joy, not just caution. Because retirement protected too tightly can still feel emotionally poor. This conversation is really about preserving options, not worshipping a number. $1 million is only useful when it keeps choices open. That means income choices, health choices, housing choices, and family choices. Over the next few minutes, we will make that number more honest. Not to scare you, but to help you protect what matters. Because planning well should create steadiness, not a lifetime of quiet fear. Now here is where the fear usually begins to quietly settle in. People start wondering if 1 million is actually enough to last. And the honest answer is that it depends on how it is used. Because retirement spending is not evenly distributed across time. It often follows a pattern most people do not expect at first. The early years tend to be more active and more expensive. This is when people travel, renovate, and reconnect with life. It feels like freedom finally being used, not just imagined. But this phase can quietly drain a portfolio faster than planned. Then comes a slower middle phase where spending stabilizes slightly. Daily routines become simpler and expenses feel more predictable. This is where many retirees start feeling more financially confident. But that confidence can be misleading if not carefully monitored, because the later phase often brings rising healthcare costs. And those costs rarely arrive in small, convenient increments. They tend to appear suddenly and stay longer than expected. So your 1 million is not just funding one lifestyle. It is funding 3 very different financial chapters. And each chapter asks for a different kind of discipline. This is why a simple yearly budget often falls short. Because life does not spend money evenly across decades. Instead, it clusters expenses in emotionally important periods. Moments when saying no feels heavier than the cost itself. Helping a child, fixing a home, or protecting your health. These are not optional expenses in the way spreadsheets assume. They are emotional commitments that shape how retirement feels. And that is where many plans quietly break under pressure. Not because the math was wrong, but because life intervened. So protecting your million means anticipating uneven spending waves. Not fearing them, but building space for them ahead of time. One helpful way to think about this is in percentages. Roughly speaking, many retirees spend about 40% early, another 30% during the middle stable years, and the final 30% later, often driven by care. These are not exact rules, but they reveal a useful pattern. Front-loaded spending creates more risk than most people realise, especially when markets are unstable during early retirement years. This is called sequence risk, though it rarely feels technical. It simply feels like bad timing that changes everything. You withdraw money while markets are down, locking in losses. And suddenly, the same lifestyle becomes harder to sustain. That is why protecting the first 5 years matters deeply. They quietly determine how flexible the next 15 will be. It is not about avoiding spending, but timing it thoughtfully, giving your portfolio room to recover when it needs to, and giving yourself permission to adjust without feeling like failure. Because adjustment is not weakness. It is long-term intelligence. The strongest retirement plans are quietly adaptable. They bend with reality instead of resisting it. And that flexibility is what keeps 1 million from becoming fragile. Now let us gently talk about the part most people try to avoid. Because the real pressure on your million is not just spending. It is inflation quietly reshaping what that money can actually do. Inflation does not feel dramatic on a single day or purchase. It feels small, almost polite, until you stretch it across years. Then it begins to erode comfort in ways that feel confusing. You are spending similarly but receiving slightly less ease. And over 20 years, that difference compounds significantly. A modest 3% inflation rate cuts purchasing power deeply. Not instantly, but steadily enough to reshape your lifestyle. This means your million is not a fixed level of comfort. It is a declining stream, unless it continues to grow. That is why keeping some money invested still matters, even when safety begins to feel more emotionally important. Many retirees slowly move everything into cash for peace. But cash alone rarely keeps up with long-term inflation. So what feels safe today can quietly become restrictive later. This creates a quiet tension between safety and growth. And that tension needs to be managed, not avoided. A balanced approach often becomes the most emotionally sustainable. Some assets providing stability, others quietly supporting growth. So your future self is not forced into uncomfortable trade-offs. Because inflation does not just affect prices. It affects choices, timing, and how freely you can live. And over time, those small constraints begin to accumulate. This is especially important when thinking about healthcare. Costs in that area tend to rise faster than general inflation. And they are often less predictable than other expenses. You cannot schedule them neatly or delay them comfortably. They arrive when they are needed, not when it is convenient. So part of protecting your million is protecting flexibility, not locking yourself into rigid spending or rigid investments. Flexibility allows you to respond without panic, and responding calmly is what preserves long-term stability. Another quiet factor is longevity, which many people underestimate. Living longer is a gift, but it also extends financial responsibility. 20 years can easily become 25 or even 30, and your plan needs to absorb that possibility gently, not with fear, but with thoughtful preparation. Because running out of money is rarely a sudden event. It is usually a gradual tightening that limits choices over time. And that is what we are really trying to prevent. Not just depletion, but restriction and emotional pressure. So when you think about your 1 million, think in layers. Spending, inflation, health, and time all interacting together. This is not meant to overwhelm you. It is meant to gently bring clarity where assumptions used to be. Because clarity is what transforms anxiety into quiet control. And control is what helps your money last without controlling you. That balance is where retirement begins to feel steady again. Now let us move into something quieter, but equally important. Because protecting your million is not only about numbers, it is also about behavior, habits, and emotional consistency. Many retirees do not lose money because of bad investments. They lose it slowly through inconsistent decisions over time. Small adjustments made in fear can quietly compound into damage, especially during uncertain markets or unexpected life events. For example, selling investments during a downturn feels protective, but it often locks in losses that could have recovered later, or spending more during good markets because things feel abundant. That can create habits that become difficult to reverse later. So consistency becomes one of the most underrated protections. Not perfection, just steady and thoughtful decision-making. Another subtle risk is lifestyle drift over time. Expenses slowly increase without a clear, conscious decision. A little more comfort here, a little more convenience there. Individually, they feel harmless, almost deserved. But together, they reshape your baseline spending quietly. And once a lifestyle expands, it is emotionally harder to reduce. So part of protection is awareness, not restriction. Knowing what truly adds value versus what simply fills space. Because retirement is less about accumulation and more about intention. You are no longer building wealth, you are using it carefully. And how you use it shapes how meaningful it feels. There is also a social layer that people rarely talk about. Friends, family, and expectations can influence spending decisions, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly than expected. Helping others can feel deeply meaningful and important, but it needs to be balanced with your own long-term stability. Otherwise, generosity today can create pressure tomorrow. And that pressure often shows up when options are already limited. So boundaries are not selfish, they are protective. They allow you to help without compromising your own security. Another overlooked factor is decision fatigue over time. Managing money for 20 years requires ongoing attention, and that can become mentally exhausting if not simplified. So creating systems becomes incredibly valuable. Automatic withdrawals, clear allocations, predictable routines. These reduce the number of decisions you need to make daily, and fewer decisions often lead to better long-term outcomes because you are less likely to react emotionally in the moment. You are simply following a plan you already trust. This creates a sense of calm that supports consistency, and calm is one of the most valuable assets in retirement. It allows you to think clearly even when conditions change. So protecting your million is not about constant vigilance. It is about building a life where vigilance is not required daily, where your system quietly supports you in the background, and where your attention can return to living, not worrying, because that is ultimately what this money was meant to provide. Now we arrive at the part that quietly brings everything together, because protecting your million is ultimately about creating income, not just preserving a balance that slowly declines over time. Income is what turns savings into something that feels sustainable. It creates rhythm, predictability, and a sense of ongoing support. Without income, every withdrawal can feel like a small loss, even when it is planned and completely reasonable. So one helpful approach is to think in income layers. Some income is stable and predictable, like pensions or benefits. Some income is flexible, coming from investments when needed. And some income can be optional, like part-time or creative work. These layers reduce pressure on any single source, and they create resilience when one layer becomes uncertain. Another concept that often helps is the withdrawal rate. Many people have heard of the 4% guideline, but in reality, it is not a fixed rule for every situation. It depends on market conditions, lifespan, and personal flexibility. Some years you may take slightly more. Other years, gently adjusting down can preserve long-term balance. This is called dynamic withdrawal, though it feels very human. You respond to reality instead of following a rigid percentage. That responsiveness is what keeps your plan alive. Not static, but quietly adapting as life unfolds. Another protective layer is having a short-term reserve. Cash or low-risk assets covering a few years of expenses. This allows you to avoid selling investments during downturns. which helps reduce the impact of sequence risks significantly. It creates breathing room when markets are not cooperating. And breathing room is often what prevents reactive decisions. There is also value in simplifying where possible. Fewer accounts, clearer strategies, and less unnecessary complexity. Because complexity often increases stress without improving outcomes. And stress can quietly lead to inconsistent decisions again. So simplicity becomes another form of protection. Not oversimplified, but thoughtfully streamlined. Finally, it helps to revisit your plan regularly, not obsessively, but with gentle, periodic awareness. Life changes, markets change, and your needs evolve. Your plan should evolve alongside those changes. That way, small adjustments prevent larger disruptions later, and you remain quietly in control of your direction. This is what turns a fixed amount into a flexible life. Not by chasing perfection, but by allowing gentle course correction. Because retirement is not a test you pass or fail. It is something you learn to navigate with increasing ease. And your million becomes a partner in that process. Not something fragile that needs constant protection, but something steady that supports your everyday life. When handled with clarity, patience, and quiet confidence, it can last longer than fear might initially suggest. And now we arrive at something softer, but just as important. Because protecting your million is not only about extending it, it is also about how that protection shapes your daily experience. Some people protect their money so tightly that life becomes smaller. They hesitate on simple joys because every expense feels threatening. And slowly, retirement begins to feel more like restriction than freedom. Others move in the opposite direction without realizing it. They spend comfortably at first, assuming things will work out. But over time, that comfort can quietly create pressure. So the real balance lives somewhere in between those extremes, where protection and enjoyment are not in conflict with each other, but instead quietly support one another over time. This is where clarity becomes deeply emotional, not just practical. Because when you trust your plan, you spend differently. You are not reacting to fear. You are responding with intention. And intention creates a very different feeling in everyday life. It allows small pleasures to feel safe instead of questionable. It allows generosity to feel thoughtful instead of risky. And it allows you to enjoy time without constantly measuring cost. Because in the end, money is not the goal of retirement. It is simply the tool that supports how you live those years. And tools are meant to be used, not just preserved carefully. So protecting your million also means using it with purpose, spending on what genuinely improves your life experience, not just what fills time or meets external expectations. This often leads to a quieter, more meaningful kind of lifestyle, one that values comfort, connection, and emotional ease, rather than constant upgrades or unnecessary complexity. And interestingly, that kind of life is often more sustainable because it aligns spending with what truly matters, instead of drifting into habits that slowly increase pressure. So the question gently shifts from how much is enough to how do I want these years to actually feel? And your answer to that question guides everything else. It shapes spending, investing, and even how you define security. Because security is not only about numbers staying intact. It is about feeling steady, supported, and quietly in control. That feeling is what most people are truly seeking, even if they initially describe it in financial terms. So if you have 1 million set aside for retirement, you have already created something meaningful and valuable. Now the focus gently shifts toward protecting its purpose, not just its size or how impressive it appears, because purpose is what gives money its real stability. And that stability is what allows you to exhale a little more, to trust that you have prepared thoughtfully and carefully, and to begin shifting from protecting life to actually living it. Because you did not plan all these years just to feel cautious. You planned so that you could feel steady and quietly free. And you are allowed to protect your future while still living today.